Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. Bone-chilling encounters told by people who work at graveyards. They share their scariest stories. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadow seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually quite a peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypt. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop them down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire family would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close it up, but others light candles and leave flowers, souvenirs, pictures, and shit. It's effing creepy, opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of people inside. Plus, when you hop down in there, you have the weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth, finger bones, or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell land, except on closer examination, all the light-colored bits are bone fragments rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant or whatever else you were putting there. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception and office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion at the cemetery entrance, which was locked, and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of New Jersey, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate, and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance, and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside the gate. There were multiple cameras, and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, so you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. We had a late afternoon service once that ran into the evening. It was October, so the sun went down early while I was filling in the grave afterwards. Conveniently, none of the lights on the loader tractor worked for some reason. No blown fuses, loose wires, or anything else. The lights just didn't work. The next day, when I reported the issue, we went over to the same tractor, and the lights worked perfectly fine. And they worked fine the rest of the time I worked there. I work at a graveyard, and I just have one thing to say: plastic. Here in Norway, graves are protected by law for 20 years, but after that the spots can be reused. Usually a grave is fine to reopen after 20 years, The body is supposed to be decomposed and pretty much gone, now back to plastic. Between the 50s and 80s, it was common here to be buried in plastic to minimize smell and leakage. I'm sure they thought it was a good idea back then, but once we started reusing graves in Norway, we realized it was a curse. A lot of the bodies are wrapped in plastic, and I've myself been part of what was supposed to be a burial at a reused site. The body was about 50 or 60 years old and should be basically gone, but nope, it was not. The plastic wrap it was covered by kept the body from decomposing, and it's basically just been marinated in its own juices for 50 or 60 years. The smell was awful, and the sight was even worse. That sounds like something that was probably a good idea in principle, but clearly not in practice. Pretty gross, but... A former funeral director here, one of our workers cleaned up after everyone had left from a visitation, viewing, or wake. It was about 9 p.m. or later, and he saw one last guest walking around the visitation room. He went to help escort the gentleman out when he discovered no one was in there. When he came back in and told us the story, and described the visitor, he identified the man in a photo we had at the funeral home. It was my grandfather, family business, who had recently passed. I worked for a county cemetery department years ago. We would go to all the cemeteries in the county and mow or just do basic upkeep. Occasionally people, mainly farmers, would stumble upon some headstones in a field or a stand of trees, and we would come out and prod the ground with dowel rods to find more headstones and re-establish the cemetery. Soon after I started working there, we got a tip about some headstones a farmer found while clearing out a path through some trees for easier access to his field. It turned out to be the oldest cemetery in the county, dating back to the 1700s. After investigating some of the names on the headstones, it got really creepy. The story is that before the cemetery was there, a schoolhouse stood there. The teachers were husbands and wives. It's not clear what exactly happened, but the students and the husband and wife all died in the schoolhouse. The information we found kinda made it sound like an illness of some kind, and they were all quarantined into school until they all died. After that, the school was demolished, and the students, husband and wife, were all buried right where the school stood. So yeah, I'm sure it's haunted. A man would come and sit in a folding chair at the burial plot of his wife. He brought the paper and books to read, his lunch, and a small portable radio with him. He would lay a large towel down and take a nap on her grave. After about a month of doing this every day and laying on her plot, he ended his life by shooting himself in the heart. I thought it was a really beautiful final act of devotion he gave, and I had complete respect for the man. I don't work in a cemetery, but I did go clean one up with my family. We cut down weeds, planted flowers, etc. So anyway, I was wiping off graves when I saw 3 graves side by side, and they didn't have the same last name. So I asked my mom if they were related, and she said no. But a woman was married to them, and they had all gotten into accidents within 2 years of being married to her. She buried them side by side, and when she passed away, she requested to be buried in a cemetery 2 counties away. It's strange because the first man died in 1984, the second died in 1986, and the third died in 1988. They were all very wealthy and owned their own businesses, and when they died, she closed the businesses. It was not really a cemetery experience, but it was still pretty freaky. My grandparents live out in the middle of nowhere, which is pretty much surrounded by woods. On their property, there was a whole family that owned my grandparents' property before them. From what I was told, they were killed or something like that. A few years ago, when I was still living with my grandparents, a relative that was related to the dead family came up to the property and wanted to remove the bodies from the land. My grandpa was extremely happy about it because he wanted to expand the house, but couldn't because he didn't want to mess with the graves. So they got together, and I stood nearby, watching them dig up 4 caskets. There were 3 adult-sized caskets and 1 child-sized casket, and they all looked really old. One of the bigger caskets had holes and cracks all over it. That was the one that my grandpa and the other relative were carrying when the body fell to the bottom of the casket. The body was pretty much bone, but it still had old muscle and tissue on it. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as I watched them uncomfortably put the body back into the casket upside down. I worked security for a nursery for trees and plants, and when they changed owners before my time, the new owners found that the old owners had dug up part of a graveyard. Broken headstones were just piled up next to still standing ones, and so the company puzzled the headstones back together and set them in concrete. All that setup is to tell you that I would be patrolling in a vehicle, and I would go past the cemetery, and there would be this coyote and an owl just hanging out in the middle of the graveyard looking at me. Happened pretty regularly. TL, DR, an owl and coyote would stare at me from a graveyard. A former funeral director here, my partner and I had just gotten back to the funeral home from a house call from a 31-year-old woman who died of cancer. As we were moving her body from the cot to the embalming table, we heard an audible click, and the radio access to the room turned on full volume. It's one of those old radios where you turn the volume dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other. He was an extremely religious man, and this event visibly shook him, and he left not long after the incident. I shut the radio off, as I typically use my phone to listen to music while embalming. When I'd finished the procedure and was attempting to move her from the embalming table to her dressing table, I heard that click from that old radio, and it turned on full volume yet again. At that point, I was fairly freaked out and made my exit not long after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever occurred to my knowledge before or after. It's not quite the same, but I had an uncle who tried working, as in selling and doing drugs in the graveyards, between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. He only lasted a few nights in that area, then never went back. What was it that scared him so badly that he felt his soul rattle in his bones as his blood froze cold? Prairie dogs. Effing prairie dogs. What's so frightening about simple ground squirrels, you might ask? Those cute little fuzzballs that scavenge whatever they can? Well, apparently, they like to randomly come out of their holes in the middle of the night and scream. Creepy, but that doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, imagine being surrounded by dozens of little rodents you can't see in the pitch black of night, surrounded by the dead, tweaked out of your mind, paranoid as hell, and then suddenly hearing hellish, blood-curdling screaming all around you. His little group scattered like roaches, and I think someone fell into a ditch, but he was convinced it was an empty grave. He never did that again. When I lived in Guam, I was impressed by their huge cemeteries with their gigantic white monuments. I was wandering through at dusk one day and saw a mist rising from one particular monument, and being a little freaked, I left quickly. It happened a few times, and I was seriously starting to question my sanity. So the next time I saw it, I decided to approach to see more detail, only to find that it was very sad brother having a cigarette with his deceased brother. I told him he had scared the crap out of me, and he said that he'd seen plenty of things there to make him question his sanity. I was a kid in '82, and Michael Jackson's Thriller was on everyone's mind. One night, it was getting late when we got caught in a big rainstorm, so we called it quits on our basketball game and went our separate ways. The big cemetery I cut through must have closed up for the night, and I found the gates locked. Going around would take forever, so I decided to climb over the fence, only to land hard on the other side. It was muddy, so I not only wrenched my ankle pretty badly, but I also took a giant mud bath. I was covered in mud, limping and groaning from pain when I reached the other side. As I emerged from the darkness, a couple saw me limping and groaning while trying to squeeze through the cemetery's wrought iron fence. I remember their screams to this day. A lady in my hometown would walk her 2 Irish wolfhounds through one of my local cemeteries. It sure was freaky to see as a kid. Before I knew that dogs as large as wolfhounds could exist, other kids also saw them from time to time, and there was a local legend about these 2 massive wolf-like specters wandering through. The rumors were sometimes out of control, and people said the demon dogs could appear and vanish at will, had red eyes, etc. I dug graves for 6 months. One afternoon, we had to dig a hole in an older cemetery because we couldn't run any heavy equipment over any of the older plots. It was super tough and took us a lot longer than usual. When we were finally close to being done, it was dark and hard to see. I remember my shovel hitting a brick in the neighboring plot before cement casks, and it coming loose. I swear to God, I saw something move inside the small hole and practically jumped out of the grave. I got back in to finish the job, but I was definitely spooked. My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer I was helping my mom with the mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that it was supposed to rain, so I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So it's about 7 in the morning, and I'm listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. Once you got to the bottom and looked up, you couldn't see the road, but you could see it again once you were about halfway up. When I finished the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave, and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 a.m. at this point. I go to the top of the hill, and there were no cars or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind, and I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on, and asked if I should call the police and tell them about the little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly wouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said yes. Why? So she proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that was just the ghost girl. Now everyone who knows me knows that I don't F with ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go up if I thought it was haunted. Now granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer. But I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes, as I have relatives buried there, but I'm always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts, and I've never seen the little ghost girl ever again.